Hey, podcast friends. This is Dr. Steve Hewlett with the podcast, Simple Healthy Choices for Weight Loss, where every week we help people who have realized that as their health has been declining over the years, the number of medications they are being prescribed is increasing. We want to help you reverse this health path so you can live the vibrant, pain-free, and hopefully medication-free life you deserve to live. If you'd like even more information on this topic, you can go to Amazon or Audible and pick up my book, Your Plate is Your Fate. And if you think my book helps you on your new health path, please tell your friends and leave a review where you purchased it. Hey, welcome back, my podcast friends. Now, in today's episode, I feel very pulled to explain something and get something off my chest that has really been driving me crazy. And this is all the information that's being floated around in all the journals and everything all around here from these pseudoscientists who are telling everybody that red meat causes inflammation and that red meat causes diabetes. So just real quick, I want to go through where this is coming from and maybe hint to why it's being said. So first thing, let's look at the inflammation, red meat causing inflammation. Now, this is something, when you go back and start looking, you see a lot of different publications talking about this. And remember, all these studies that are done that I'm getting ready to say, these are all observational studies, meaning they did no studies whatsoever. They didn't do any lab work. They didn't do anything. Basically, if you've listened to my podcast, it's just like what happened with Ansel Keys when he was saying that fat is what made you fat. And now all of our food manufacturers and everything went off and came up with new dietary guidelines made off of this incorrect statement that was made back by Ansel Keys. And I did a whole podcast on that one earlier. But that's basically what's going on here as well. There's no studies being done. It's all observation. But from this, you have things like Consumer Reports that's telling people that red meat directly triggers inflammatory responses in the body. Then you have the Harvard Health Publishing that says red meat causes inflammation. Then you have realsimple.com. They say red meat is the number 4 inflammatory food on the planet. Then even publications like Women's Health, which puts out millions of publications to these women, they even say the 3rd most inflammatory food that you can put in your mouth is red meat. Then GoodRx Health, they say that red meat is the 4th most inflammatory food on the planet. And then there's the Insider, says red meat is number 2 on the most inflammatory foods you can eat. And then there is the Cleveland Clinic that says red meat is the 3rd most inflammatory food that you can eat. All these publications, all these headlines are based off nothing, just observation, just by reading something and thinking that it's true, no studies. Anytime you're doing a study on inflammation, you've got to take a CRP. That's a C-reactive protein. That is like the gold standard right now for inflammation. If you have a very high CRP, you have inflammation. If you don't have a high CRP, you don't have inflammation. Basically, and they did not do any of that at all. They took no labs. So looking around, trying to find one study that could be actually useful. And there was one that was found, and this was from the American Society of Nutrition. And this one was actually done appropriately. And it was a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis, if you don't know, a meta-analysis means that you're not actually doing the study. What you're doing is you're looking at all the other studies that have been done in the area that you're trying to do the meta-analysis on. You're looking at all the studies, you're comparing them with each other, you're looking at what they did right, what they did wrong, and then you come all the conclusions from all those studies, and then you make one big meta-analysis saying, after everything else was thrown out, this is what seems to be true from all the studies being done. And from the American Society of Nutrition, there was a study that was done. It's called The Effects of Total Red Meat Intake on Glycemic Control and Inflammatory Biomarkers, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, which is probably the best kind of study that you can do. It's a meta-analysis, but then it's randomized and it's controlled trials. And what they stated in this, it says that total red meat consumption for up to 16 weeks does not affect changes in biomarkers of glycemic control nor inflammation in adults. So the main study, the only study out there that really looked at a bunch of studies and truly analyzed them, they come out saying that there is no effect on inflammation by eating red meat. They also say there's no effect on diabetes from eating red meat. However, recently, this beast has reared its ugly head again, and now we're starting to see this in a lot of publications again. Now they're saying that red meat causes diabetes, and you'll see through this why this makes no sense. I mean, it's just idiotic. So basically, the same kinds of things. There were other studies that were done that are all saying the same things, and this is all from one study. This is a study that was in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that was published back in October of 2023. Okay, so this was very recent, and this is why everybody's talking about this. And this says that red meat intake and risk of type 2 diabetes in a prospective cohort study of United States females and males. They had over 216,000 participants in this study. So it seems like, oh, that would be good. You've got a lot of people and you can really come up with some good data here. However, that's not what happened because, again, they did no studies on this whatsoever. What they did was they looked at some old studies that were done. So there's no new studies, even though this just came out in October 2023. They were looking at old studies from the Nurses Health Study, which is the NHS, and then the Nurses Health Study 2, the Nurse Health Study 2, NHS 2, and then also the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, which is HPFS. And the way they did this was they sent out all these food frequency questionnaires, FFQs. If you don't know what an FFQ is, Google it. Google and just say food frequency questionnaires. And what they did was they've mailed out all these questionnaires to all these people, and they asked them, what did they eat? Okay. Now, this would be great if you did this like every day or even every week. And you said, what did you eat today? Or what did you eat yesterday? Or what did you eat last week? And then they say, like, how many hamburgers did you have? How many ribs did you have? It all depends on the food frequency questionnaire that you're looking at. But these don't do that. These were taken and they were sending these out and asking people about what their average intake of this meat over the last 2 to 4 years. So think about if you get a questionnaire in the mail and it says, how many hamburgers did you eat on the average per month 3 years ago? You'd be like, what? I can't remember what I ate last week, let alone 3 years ago, 2 years ago. And that's exactly what this is. They are food frequency questionnaires asking people kind of in general, what did you eat over a certain period of time? And there's so many things wrong with this. I mean, usually the biggest one is you can't remember. Who's going to remember what they ate that long ago? And then people do remember, they kind of fudge on their answers because they don't want to make it look too bad. They want to make it look like they did pretty good when they were eating. And the basic thing they do is they just guesstimate. It's like, I think it may be something around this amount. So there's nothing that you can actually get from these types of studies. When they did these studies, they did, again, no studies. This is trying to say that red meat causes diabetes. However, they never did any blood tests in any of these. No blood tests were done. They never checked an A1C before, during, or after, which you have to check if you're going to be talking about diabetes. There was no fasting insulin checked, which you have to do that because that's what diabetes is. It's high insulin levels and high blood glucose levels. They didn't even check for any of this stuff. They didn't even do continuous glucose monitoring in these people. They did nothing. They did no studies whatsoever. They just got this information from these food frequency questionnaires. So when you start to look into it just a little bit deeper and wonder what's going on, come to find out this was actually done. Oh, another thing, before I get into this, another thing, when they do say this, if they have to ask on a questionnaire, they say they ask, how many hamburgers did you eat on the average last month or last year, whatever. They don't say, did you eat this with a bun, which is going to increase your chance of diabetes? Did you eat this with French fries, which will increase your chance of diabetes? Was this eaten with onion rings? Was this eaten with ketchup? All these things. Did you drink a diet soda or did you drink a soda with this? All those things would go into that because all those things do increase your chance of getting type 2 diabetes. but it's not the meat, but they're going to say it. Why would they say something like this? Well, come to find out, the senior author on this study was Walter Willett. Walter Willett is a professor of epidemiology of nutrition at Harvard School of Public Health. And it is well known that Walter Willett is a very, very strong supporter of a plant-based diet. He always has been. And just the fact that you're going into a study that's not an actual real study where you do no test at all, no lab work at all you do is observational things. If you have something in your mind that's one thing is right, when you look at an observational study, your biases will just naturally creep into that, which again is exactly what happened when we were talking about Ansel Keys and his bias saying that by eating fat, that's what makes you fat. And that's where he came back and he convinced everybody else to say that. And that's when our new dietary guidelines come out. It's the same thing with this. Mr. Willett is a very strong proponent saying that everyone should be eating a plant-based diet for whatever reasons he has, because there's no studies that show any of this. But because of this, his observational studies have ended up turning into what his views are on what you should actually be doing as far as eating healthy meals. And because of this study, now you've got all this other stuff. And again, this didn't prove anything. This study didn't prove anything whatsoever. But because of the study, now you have people like Forbes magazine, which is coming out and saying that more than one red meat serving a week can increase diabetes risk. Study finds, talking about this same observational study that did no test whatsoever. Then the New York Times, they've got an article saying what to know about the link between red meat and type 2 diabetes. What you should know is there is no link. There never was a link. There is not a link. And none of these studies prove that there's any link. It's just strictly an observation of what someone thinks. Then you have local news stations. Some of these local news stations that I looked at said eating any red meat increases the risk of type 2 diabetes, study finds. So all these titles that are coming out are all based off this same study that shows nothing whatsoever. CNN Health even came out and said eating red meat is linked to higher risk of type 2 diabetes, study finds. And again, this is the study they're talking about it. And even National Geographic says even a small amount of red meat can increase your diabetes risk. And then the Harvard School of Public Health, they're the ones that came out with this huge study that says that eating red meat, people who eat just 2 servings of red meat per week may have an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes. All of these articles are crazy. They're lies. There is nothing that says any of this. This is the perfect example of someone is trying to get us to stop eating the healthy food that we've been eating since the beginning of time. We have been eating this food forever. No other animal on the planet has to be told what kind of food to eat. And humans didn't used to have to be either until man-made food came up. Once we started making our man-made ultra-processed food that is made with ultra-processed carbohydrates, high fructose corn syrup and sugar, and extremely inflammatory vegetable oils and seed oils. And if you want to know about any of that stuff, look back. I've got podcasts that talks about those as well. But these people that make this kind of food out of that, did you notice that there's no meat? Listen to that. You are not going to find any red meat in bags, in bottles, well, you will see some in cans, but basically anything that's in a bag, box, or bottle, you're not going to find meat. They make their living off of carbohydrates. Which comes from plant-based food. That is carbohydrates. Everything that you eat from those manufacturers are carbohydrates that get broken down to glucose. And as you know, diabetes is a blood glucose problem and a blood insulin problem. And all carbohydrates get turned into glucose. And once your blood glucose goes up, your insulin levels goes up. You do this over, 10, 20 years of keeping your insulin levels up and your blood glucose up. Now you're going to end up with diabetes and with metabolic syndrome and all the other horrible things that happen with cardiovascular disease, blood pressure problems, with Alzheimer's, kidney dysfunction, liver dysfunction, pancreatic dysfunction, everything else that comes from eating these carbohydrates. So there's something going on, and I don't know what it is. You can figure out what it is, but there's some reason why they are not wanting us to eat meat. They're not wanting us to be healthy, because if you think about it, if you eat meat that is extremely filling, you're not going to have a lot of room in your body to start eating these ultra processed carbs from these food manufacturers. And if you're healthy, you're not going to be using a lot of medications. So the manufacturers of the food and the manufacturer of the drugs both are going to be losing a lot of money if people were walking around healthy and eating the way they should be eating, where they are eating red meat. If this was really a deal, there's a huge thing with the carnivore diet. Carnivore diet, which means you eat nothing but meat, is huge and it's growing. And the ketogenic diet, which means eat mostly protein and fat and very, very little carbohydrates. If this was true, that this caused any kind of diabetes, these people would be screaming from the rooftop saying they tried these diets and they ended up getting diabetes. And they're not. They're doing the exact opposite. There are so many people that are on the ketogenic diet or actually, it's just the natural food diet. I'm not pushing any certain diet. I just want you to realize that you really need to eat God-made food. God made this food for us because he made our bodies and he knows what our body needs. And that is going to be real animal meat, real vegetables, and real fruit. Okay? No barcodes, no ingredient list, just real meat like we've been doing since the beginning of time. The only reason it's getting screwed around right now is because of the drug manufacturers and the food manufacturers that are trying to tell us what they need us to do in order to keep their bottom line growing bigger and bigger. So you've got to take your health into your own hands and not listen to these pseudoscientists that don't even do studies, and they just come out and they start talking to people about what they should be eating. So now let's look at this so-called study. Let's look at that again and see a little bit more of what's going on. One of the big thing is that anytime you do a study like this, you have to have what's called a hazard ratio. Okay, the hazard ratio. And the higher the hazard ratio, the more likely it is that this is true. This is a severe thing that you have to worry about. So like back in the smoking, when we were first finding out about how horrible smoking was, they started doing a bunch of smoking studies. And the hazard ratio for these smoking studies saying that smoking causes cancer, this hazard ratio was around 15 to 30, depending on which study. That's huge. That is a high hazard ratio that proves that, yes, smoking does cause cancer. It does cause other health issues. Now, if you have a hazard ratio of 1, that means there's no association at all. There's no association. The hazard ratio for this study was 1.4. Not 14, not 140. It was 1.4. And remember, 1 means no association at all. And basically, the standard rule of thumb is if you have a hazard ratio of less than 2, then it's probably just background noise and you should ignore it and move on. Unless you have an agenda, unless you're trying to tell people that the healthiest thing they can eat is actually killing them. Why would somebody be telling you that? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Okay. Now, the other thing with this is they did say that the incidence of type 2 diabetes is increasing annually. And that is true. Ever since 1977, every single year, our type 2 diabetes rate has increased every single year, and it is skyrocketing. It's not just increasing by a little bit, it's increasing by a lot. Okay. The other thing that they don't tell you is since our dietary guidelines came out, when they started telling everybody that fat is what made you fat, so they told everybody you need to stay away from fat, you need to stay away from animal meat, and you need to eat all these carbohydrates. They came up with this phony food pyramid that has the whole bottom saying most of the things that we eat should be our grains and our pastas. It's the worst things we could be eating, and that's what's causing our type 2 diabetes. So while in its own study, they actually talk about how our type 2 diabetes rates are going up more and more every single year, what they don't say is the amount of meat that people are eating is actually going down every single year because of the food initiative, because of what these people are trying to tell everybody. Because most people, they want to eat right. They really want to eat right. They don't know who to trust. They don't know what's going on. They hear all these different things, and I totally get it. So you can avoid all this crazy stuff that you hear. Do not ever think that somebody, just because they say they're a scientist or did some study, you have to look at what kind of study they did. And just like you said, or just like I showed, if you have one study that shows something, now you have all these publications that are coming out here and they can put their own twist on it, just like the ones where some said there's a link. Some said that, more than 2 servings is going to cause diabetes or inflammation, and more than 3 servings. I mean, people just come make up their own stuff. So I'm going to make it easy on you. Okay. Just think common sense. Okay. 2 things that you need to think about. Our red meat consumption has been going down year after year ever since our new dietary guidelines came up. Okay, so our meat consumption is going down every single year. Our carbohydrate consumption is going up every single year. Our type 2 diabetes is going up every single year. Inflammatory disease is going up every year. Metabolic syndrome is going up every year. Blood pressure, cardiovascular diseases, Alzheimer's, all these conditions, if you look at it, they've had a huge increase since our dietary guidelines came out in 77 that's telling everybody to eat more carbs and less meat. And this is where we're seeing all the diseases. And this is why you have these pseudoscientists out here putting out this fake stuff with no mechanism behind it. None of these studies show. Now, how does red meat actually cause diabetes? Okay, so diabetes is a problem of having too much glucose and too much insulin. Protein, okay, we've already talked about. Fat does not increase your insulin at all. It has no effect on insulin. Protein has very, very little effect on insulin. Okay, very little effect. Carbohydrates have a huge effect on insulin. Carbohydrates get broken down to their basic building block of glucose. Okay, proteins get broken down to their basic building block of amino acids. Fat gets broken down to their basic building blocks of fatty acids. Those are not glucose. Carbohydrates get broken down into glucose. So what on earth would they think would be the mechanism of how meat and fat is causing your insulin and your blood glucose levels to rise? It's idiotic. It makes no sense. That does not happen. What does make sense is that somebody's making a lot of money off putting this kind of information out there. I want my listeners, I want the people who listen to me to understand, because I know people say it's so hard to understand. How do you know to believe? How would you know to believe me? How would you know to believe them? And that's why I'm trying to explain it to you about what happens in your body when nutrition, when you take food into your body, what does your body actually do with that? And that's what all my podcasts are done. That's why I've tried to start this podcast, because when you look at that, that tells you your mechanism of action. That tells you what's really happening. And there is nothing that shows that protein and fat increases blood glucose or blood insulin levels. However, a lot of studies prove, just physiological, that obviously carbohydrates do both. They do increase your blood glucose. They do increase your blood insulin levels, and that increases your chance for type 2 diabetes. Okay. So all I'm saying is be aware when you hear crazy things out there, just because somebody says they're a scientist, and especially if they say they're from somewhere like Harvard or something like this, don't just take that for face value. You've got to look at everything else. Where was the study done? How many people were done? Did they do any studies whatsoever? Did they do any tests at all? You've got to know this stuff. So the answer is, does red meat cause inflammation, and does red meat cause type 2 diabetes? No and no, emphatically no, they do not. So please be aware there are alternative motives. I don't know what they are. Maybe you do. You can think about it, but I guarantee it is not about your health, because food companies and drug companies do not want you healthy. The healthier you are, the less money they make. That's just business, and that's fine. They are a business. Let them do their business, but that doesn't mean that you have to eat it. That doesn't mean that you have to put your health in their hands, because that is the worst thing you could possibly do. You want to keep your health in your own hands. And so I know I've gone on and on about this, but it really is important to me that you guys understand that there's a lot of misinformation out there and you've got to be able to weed through it. And if anybody has any questions at all, please contact me. You can come through Facebook or Instagram or the podcast. Get a hold of me. And I hope this helps clear up some of the misinformation that you're hearing. And if you have any questions, please try to get a hold of me, ask. But I'll let you go for now. And thank you so much for listening and have a great week. And remember, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button below and be sure to tell someone else who may want to change their health path as well. And don't forget, you can also purchase my book, Your Plate is Your Fate, on Amazon or Audible. And if you do, please leave a review.